Alright guys, we are back in my garage for another video, and today we are going to be replacing the oil filter housing on my 340i. I know a lot of you guys have been asking me to make a DIY, and up until now I haven't had to, but unfortunately the day finally came. Now I'm going to be making a separate video that talks more about the failures and what causes it and how you can identify if this is something that you actually need to do. But in this video, we're just going to focus strictly on the process to replace it on a B58 engine. So I'll show you guys how it's done, and hopefully you guys find this video useful. Now, as always, for everybody that's new to the channel, I create these videos to help keep you updated on the latest developments in our community, as well as discuss technical topics so that we have a better understanding of how our engines work. So if you're interested in more videos like that, be sure to subscribe because there will be a lot more coming out in the future. Hey you, don't be a silly goose. This job requires disconnecting electrical connectors, so that means that it's a good idea to disconnect the negative terminal on your battery. This will make sure that you minimize the chance of causing electrical issues while you're in the process of doing this DIY. So pop open your trunk, open up the battery access panel, and grab a 10mm socket to loosen the negative terminal on your battery. I also highly recommend putting a microfiber towel on top of the battery so that you don't inadvertently complete the circuit while you're in the middle of the job. And it's a good idea to put a microfiber towel through the trunk latch so that you can avoid closing the trunk by mistake. Alright, now let's go ahead and get back to the DIY. Alright guys, now I'm going to show you how to replace the oil filter housing on your B58, but this job is pretty involved. There are a lot of parts that you need to remove, and I've made a bunch of DIYs on how to remove those components already, so we're going to kind of skip forward to the stuff that's really specific to just replacing the housing itself. So a lot of you guys have already gotten to this point multiple times on your car, so you'll probably know how to get this far, but if you don't, here are the basic steps of what you need to follow. So the first thing you're going to need to do is remove the intake, and I do have an intake DIY that you can follow if you need help removing that. You also need to remove the charge pipe, which again, I've got a DIY on how to replace your charge pipe. So you can follow that if you need that guidance. And then you're also going to need to remove your intake manifold. Now, I have a Bimmer Network intake manifold, so if you have an aftermarket one like mine with port injection and stuff, it's a little bit more involved. You know, you got to deal with fuel and stuff like that. So you can check out my Bimmer Network intake manifold DIY to see that. Or if you just have a stock intake manifold, then you can also follow my port injection spacer DIY that shows you how to remove the stock intake manifold from your B58. Now you're also going to need to drain some of your coolant. So with the intake manifold, you're going to drain your low temp cooling system, but this oil filter housing also has your oil cooler built onto it. So you're also going to need to drain off the coolant from your main engine cooling system. Now, to be honest, I'm doing this at the same time as my turbo replacement. So you guys might have seen my DIY. I should have posted that already by the time this video is out. So I'm doing that because it requires a lot of the same work. But if you haven't, or if you aren't doing that and you're not in the same situation, then draining the engine coolant is pretty simple. You're just going to go under the car, disconnect one of the hoses that are connected either to your main radiator or one of your auxiliary radiators, and that will drain out the coolant from your engine cooling system. So since I'm doing my turbo, I don't need to do that separately. I've already got all my coolant drained, but do that because otherwise you'll make a pretty big mess when you remove the oil filter housing. So now this is what we have. So you can kind of see the top of your oil filter cap right here. I have the Paradigm Engineering one, but this is what most of us can see with everything installed, but it goes way down. And you can kind of see it's mounted onto this big plastic piece that's down here, and it's bolted onto the side of the engine. So what we're going to need to do is basically remove some of these hoses and things that are in our way so we can access all those screws and remove the entire housing from the engine. Now, just a warning, this is just the process that I use to swap the oil filter housing. This does not match the BMW manual because it does require removing the transmission cooler, and I didn't want to do that. So this is just the process that I followed to access all of those bolts and get the housing off. So the first thing you want to do is unplug the water pump. There's a single connector on top, and it's just like every other one on our cars. Just pop up the gray tab and squeeze, and then you can pull it off. Move that wire out of the way, and then there are two clips holding the water pump onto this mounting bracket. Slide them off with the help of a small screwdriver, and just make sure you keep a finger on them, because if they come off, they're going to want to fall somewhere in the engine bay. Then pull the pump off of the mounting bracket. The tabs might be on there wedged pretty good, so just wiggle it back and forth and use a little bit of force until it comes out. Then there are two coolant hoses that need to come off. One is on the side. Undo the C-clip and then pull it off. And then there's also one on the bottom. It'll be a little bit easier to access if you lift it up and turn it around a little bit. And then again, same thing, undo the clip and pull the hose off. And I apologize, I know these angles aren't the best to show what I'm doing, but the space here is obviously really tight, and I had to use two hands to get some of these hoses off. They're just on there really tight, so you should get the idea of what's going on. Then here you can see a closer look at how those clips work. So basically they slide into these slots on the water pump tabs and snap into place, and that's what secures it onto the mounting bracket. If you wedge a screwdriver in between the clip and twist and pry it up, you'll be able to get it up and over the tab so you can slide it off. It's pretty simple once you know what you're looking at. After that, we need to remove this main coolant hose going to this junction piece. Again, just like the others, pop up the C-clip and then pull on the hose until it comes off of the junction. Now at this point, I think it's a good idea to look at the new housing you bought to get familiar with the bolt locations. There are two right on top that are easy to access. Then there's a third one on the right, just on the other side of the oil filter. As you work your way down the left side, you'll see another one that's underneath this coolant connection that will need to be disconnected. And then unfortunately it gets worse, because if you go lower on the right side, there are two more screws. These are harder to reach, almost impossible to see, but it's not as hard to access if you keep in mind that these little recesses for the oil cooler will allow you to access the bolts. So lining up your socket wrench with those little recesses will help you access them a lot easier. But just keep this visual in mind as you go back into your engine bay and try to access all of these screws. Now at this point, I went ahead and removed the DME and the DME mount. The reason is because when I tried accessing the bolts without doing this, it was almost impossible. You might not need to, but again, these are just the steps I followed to get the best access. So disconnect all 6 of the DME connectors and then unclip and remove the DME from the holder. Keep in mind the connectors only go on one way, so you don't need to number them or anything. You can't really mix them up. Then this is the strategy I used to get to the bolts. So for the top 2, I just used a long extension with my e-torque socket on the end, and I routed it through this nest of coolant hoses until it was on the bolt that I wanted. Then I pulled out my socket wrench and used it to loosen the bolt. So this was pretty easy for the top 2. As you can see, it wasn't too much work, but they won't completely come out, and that's a good thing. You know, it makes it easier to install when you replace this, but as you're loosening it, you'll kind of feel some resistance because it seems like the size of the bolt might be slightly longer than it needs to be, so you can't fully loosen it. So just back it off until you start feeling resistance and leave it there. Then on top of the housing, you'll see a small clip from one of the wiring harnesses, so use a screwdriver to pull that off. Then for the third screw, again, I routed a slightly smaller extension onto it with my e-Torx bit. It's still not the worst one since I can still see the screw, but you can see I had to route it a little bit creatively to get it onto this bolt. So again, route it down there, get it on the screw, and then use your socket wrench to loosen it. Now down below on the left, we're going to start working on accessing the 4th bolt. Here on the heat management module, you can see there's another connector that needs to be disconnected. Pop off the tab, pull it off, then move those wires out of the way. And then we can see the other end of the coolant hose that was attached to the water pump. This is the connection that goes onto the oil filter housing. So same thing, pop off the C-clip, pull the coolant hose off. To give me a little more access, I went ahead and removed the oil filter. It just seemed like I was working around it too much. So I just unscrewed it using my 32mm socket and then moved it out of the way. Make sure you put some rags underneath because a little bit of oil will come out. And then at this point, I also wisened up and removed the entire DME holder. So unplug the other connectors. Again, they can't be mixed up, so you don't have to worry about tracking them too much. And then remove this module that's sitting behind the DME. And then there are 2 screws that hold the DME mount in place. Remove both of those, and then remove the wires that are clipped onto the mount. If you flip it over, the connectors that are attached to it have these little release tabs in the slots on the bottom. Use a small pick tool to pry the tabs, and then the connectors should slide out of their slots. There are probably a couple options for which coolant hoses you can or need to remove. I just removed this one as well that's going to the main coolant line going to the engine. I also unclipped it from the mount by squeezing on the hose clamp pin that's locked into this mount. Again, this just makes it more flexible as I try to access the remaining screws. And then finally, I had access to the fourth screw. So this one is under that coolant connection. If you route your extension under there, you should be able to feel it, even if you can't see it easily. And then go ahead and loosen that one. Then for the last two bolts, like I said, you won't really be able to see them, but they are down there, and you can route your extension into one of those two recesses on the oil cooler, and the bolt is there, so you'll kind of have to feel it a little bit with the extension. Once you get it on there, attach your socket wrench and loosen the screws. I can't show it super clear because of their location, but again, if you look at your new housing, then you can visualize where they are. I was committed to not removing the trans cooler that's next to it, and honestly, no regrets. Once I got it off, it was pretty simple. Now, as things start coming off, more oil and coolant will be coming out, so just make sure you have your bucket underneath to catch the dripping fluid. And then lastly, there is one hose connected onto the housing. Just use a screwdriver to pry that off, and then at that point, we're ready to remove the entire housing. If you pull on it and feel any resistance from the screws, they'll probably just need a couple more turns to fully release them. Like I said before, I kind of stopped when I felt resistance because of the type of screw and how they don't fully come out. So it still required a few turns that I could do by hand to fully release the housing. And then as you're pulling it off, just watch all the wires and hoses that are in your way. There are some additional wire harnesses that are clipped onto the side, so you'll need a screwdriver to pry them off. Then just take your time maneuvering it and making sure it's not hanging up on anything, as you should have disconnected everything to get it out. Then once it's out, go ahead and grab a cream soda and celebrate your victory. Now, there are a couple things that you need to swap over to your new oil filter housing before reinstalling. The first thing is your oil cooler. It has oil and coolant flowing inside of it, so make sure you have a rag down because some more oil and coolant will come out. There are 6 screws that need to be removed, so work your way around and unscrew all of them. Then the oil cooler should come off. If any gaskets stick to it like mine, go ahead and remove those too. Now, I looked at mine and I couldn't see any cracks or leaks or anything like that, so I'm still not 100% sure where the leak was coming from. I saw evidence under the cooler and it was so dirty I could tell that, there was oil, so maybe just one of the gaskets was leaking, but I didn't experience cracking that some other people seem to have experienced. And for reference, my car has 65,000 miles. The previous owners had various setups, nitrous, big turbo, a couple other things used for drag racing. And then in my ownership, I had it on the stock turbo, and I've done some track days and road courses. So go ahead and clean the surface of your oil cooler to prepare it to transfer. I just use some brake clean on a rag, or you can use like a plastic scraper tool. I wouldn't recommend using anything super sharp or metal like a razor blade because it can gouge the surface, and you don't want to affect how the gaskets will seal for the oil and coolant ports. You just don't want to create any additional problems. Now, this is probably the second most frustrating part for me. The screws need to be swapped over to the new housing, and some people made it look super easy. They said just pull the screws out and push them into the new one. They have these black O-rings that hold them in place, and it should be able to be pulled out, but mine were just stuck in there. So, of course, when I finally got them out, the whole bushing came out with them. And then some of them I couldn't pull out, so I had to tap them out with my preferred motivational tool. Then I had to use a pair of box wrenches to pry the screws out, and it worked a few times, but on 2 of the screws, I ripped the O-rings. So thankfully, I was able to get a replacement O-ring that fit from Ace Hardware, but overall, this is not recommended. Just to make it simple, I would recommend buying replacement bolts, and I have the part numbers in the video description if you guys just want to order 6 new screws. Now, the housing is completely stripped. Go ahead and put it in a plastic bag and take her out back to take her out of her misery. And we can go ahead and grab the new housing. So let's prepare it for install. The first thing I did was reinstall the world's most annoying screws into their holes, lube them up with a little bit of oil to make it easier, and then push them into the slots. If the bushings slide out a little bit like mine did, you can use your motivational tool to tap them back into place. Then grab your oil cooler and place it on the new housing. Tighten all 6 of the screws to hold it in place, and I'll put the torque specs in the video description for your reference. It doesn't require like a special torquing sequence or anything, but I did try to use a somewhat star-shaped pattern just to help it screw on as flat as possible. Now, the housing also comes with an oil filter and cap, but I've seen enough horror stories of people having issues removing theirs, so I went ahead and swapped it with my man filter and paradigm cap. It was torqued to a ridiculous spec, which I don't know if that's a part of the problem, but this is what it took for me to finally get it off when I had it on my bench. But I left my filter and cap off until it was reinstalled since I knew I'd want the extra space anyway. Back in the engine bay, go ahead and wipe down and clean your mating surface on the engine to prepare it for reassembly. Again, if any gaskets are stuck onto it, just pull them off and wipe down everything, and then go ahead and drop in your new oil filter housing. The same way you probably had to loosen the bolts while you were pulling it off, I'd recommend starting all 6 bolts before fully tightening any of them. You want some wiggle room to get the bolts threaded in, and then once all 6 are started with no cross threading, then you can fully seat the housing and begin torquing them to spec. Again, I'll have the specs in the video description for reference. The torque specs are very low, so if you're tightening them by hand, don't go crazy. I only tighten them with the extension and my fingers, not even using a socket wrench or any power tools, and that will avoid stripping the threads when you tighten them down. And then, yeah, just like always, the installation is reversive removal. Reconnect all of your coolant lines. If you need help identifying what goes where, you can always go back in my video, and it should give you an idea of the orientation of the hoses and wires. There are a lot of different size connectors, so you usually can't mix them up easily. Then reinstall your intake manifold and all of your bolt-ons. Reinstall the DME holder along with your DME, and always give those connectors a tug to confirm they're fully seated, because it's really easy to install them loosely and then your car won't start. Top off your oil since you lost a little bit during the job. I added about a half liter just to be on the safe side. I probably didn't lose that much, but that's just what I did. And then also fill up and bleed your cooling system. I'll be making a separate video on the vacuum bleed process in the future, but this just makes the process a lot faster to get your coolant system filled up and completely bled. And yeah, after that, take your car for a test drive, keep an eye on your oil and coolant levels for the next day or two, and top off as needed, and enjoy your new super reliable, definitely won't fail again oil filter housing. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it for this video. So thank you guys for watching, and I hope this helps. And if you have any other questions or comments, leave them down below.